right, welcome everybody. I am thrilled to see so many faces on the call tonight. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Julia Leaf. I am the Executive Director of Cambridge Common Writers. We are an independent nonprofit organization for the alums of Lesley University's MFA in Creative Writing. And we are so excited to have Benjamin and Jody with us here tonight to celebrate both of their books launches this month. It's very exciting for, I believe, Benjamin, this is his very first event for his book, so we're thrilled to be given that privilege. So I won't take up too much time because I want to get us started, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Cambridge Common Writers is committed to fostering an inclusive and welcoming environment for all of our community members, so please be aware that any instances of racist or misogynistic speech or the use of slurs intended to demean any group or individual will not be tolerated and will be grounds for removal from the Zoom call. So with that said, I'm going to hand things over to Michael and we'll get started.
Thank you, Julia. My name is Michael Mercurio. Those of you who have been at previous Cambridge Common Writers events for either Ben or Jody may recognize me as having hosted those events. It is my distinct pleasure to be back here with you tonight in this virtual space to celebrate two new books, one from Ben, one from Jody. I've read both of them. I am not exaggerating when I say that these writers just keep getting better. And I am thrilled that Ben is here celebrating the Rest of Your Life soundtrack. I am delighted that Jody is here celebrating Without You Here. They are marvelous books that are in conversation with each other in a very interesting way. And you'll get to hear some of that tonight as our writers are in conversation with each other in what I can assure you will be a very interesting way. So before I make myself scarce and let the writers do the reading thing, I want to introduce them. Benjamin Roesch is a writer, musician, teacher, podcaster, award-winning essayist, and author of the YA novel Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze. For 12 glorious, exhausting years, he was a high school English teacher. He is now a full-time writer based in Burlington, Vermont, where he lives with his family. His most recent book, which is what we're celebrating tonight, is The Rest of Your Life soundtrack, a sequel to Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze. Jody Hobbs Hesler is the author of the story collection, What Makes You Think You're Supposed to Feel Better, which, just as an aside, is one of my favorite titles ever. She's also the author of the novel Without You Here, which is the book we're celebrating tonight. Jody's words also appear in multiple journals, including Necessary Fiction, Gargoyle, Valparaiso Fiction Review, Atticus Review, Writer's Digest, Electric Literature, Craft, Arts and Letters, and elsewhere. Jody teaches at Writer House in Charlottesville, Virginia. She writes and copy edits for Virginia Wine and Country Life and Charlottesville Family Magazine, and she serves as assistant fiction editor for the Los Angeles Review. I will be dropping their author website links into the chat shortly so you can follow them and find out what they're up to next. But for now, I'm going to spotlight Ben and let him do some reading, and then we'll follow that with Jody.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm just paranoid about the audio. Well, thank you to Michael and to Julia for convening and hosting this. It's definitely a labor of love that they do running the alumni organization, which is the alumni organization for Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where we all met. It's where I met Jody years ago, and we were friends in our MFA program. So it's a treat to share the virtual stage with her. Jody and I actually reconnected sort of recently in a sort of a serendipitous way. I host a podcast with another writing friend, and we had Jody on the show to talk about craft and to talk about her stories. And we sort of traded books as we were gearing up to the release of these new works. And I don't know, just kind of can rekindle a friendship that we'd had back at Lesley, and then said, hey, you want to maybe do an event together? And so here we are. So thank you to all of you for being part of this. And thanks to all the people that are out there in digital land. I can't see everybody, but I can see my friend Stacy. I can see my Aunt Margaret down in North Carolina. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to do a very short reading from my new book, The Rest of Your Life Soundtrack, and just say a couple of words about it, and then kick it over to Jody to do a brief reading from her novel, Without You Here. And then we're just going to have kind of an open conversation, sort of led by Michael, but with all of us as well. So again, this is the new book, The Rest of Your Life Soundtrack. It is the sequel to my debut novel from 2022, Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze, which I also have here. You can see the covers go really nicely together, I think. And both are about the same main character, who is teen music prodigy Rainey Cobb. And this book finds Rainey about a year after the end of Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze. So I think I'm just going to read this very opening section, which is entitled Track 0. It's meant to be a little bit of a prologue. So here we go. Track 0, Let There Be Decision. I yank on my winter coat and step out into the bitter December cold, trudging through calf-deep snow toward the treehouse. The rope ladder sways and creaks as I climb. I haven't been up here since the leaves turned to scarlet, then to brown, then to so much fallen dust. Sitting down on the love seat, I click on the camp lantern, hoping the batteries still work. Let there be light. With my breath blooming in the frozen air, I slip my headphones over the thick wool blanket of my beanie, then click on Elliott Smith's Either Or. Let there be sound. Finally, I pull the 2 envelopes out of my coat pocket and set them on the table. Bright white and blandly official, their blank faces are utterly indistinguishable, like creepy robotic twins from a Philip K. Dick story. Let there be decision. Eeny, meeny, miny, thump. The treehouse trembles with sudden sound, a heavy, dull thud. I rip my headphones off and stop the tape. Is it midnight already? But there's no sister sound to follow the first, which means it can't be the fireworks yet. Hello? I ask stupidly, trying to make sense of the noise. I try to resettle on the task at hand. No biggie, just figuring out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. But I can't focus now because, seriously, what the hell was that? Curiosity has me first down the rope ladder, then back into the heavy snow. I catch a whiff of wood smoke from the fire Dad was still stoking when I came outside, even though he looked terrible and way past tired, and Mom was already snoring on the couch. I look up at the side of the treehouse, not sure what I'm expecting to see. Then I see it, not up, but down, an inky black swell. It's a small raven, still and silent atop the crystal white blanket. Holding up the lantern to get a better look, I can see that one of its wings is twisted unnaturally down, like someone whose pen drifted off the page. The bird's neck is similarly off its axis. I look up at the treehouse again, then back down at the smashed raven. Taking off my mitten, I hover my hand over the raven's body, which emits a barely perceptible but already diminishing warmth. I watch the bird until my ribs rattle with the cold, but the raven's chest reveals no movement, not even a final tremble. Now feeling really good and freaked out, and even further away from figuring out my life, I go back up to the treehouse and wait for my heart to slow down. The envelopes are still there on the coffee table, staring at me, daring me to open one and choose already. What do you want? Thump. Not again, I think, picturing a flock of ravens storming out of the woods and going full kamikaze against the treehouse, then dropping to the frozen earth. But this sound is different, concussive and reverberating, followed by another and another, an unsteady drum beat out there somewhere, the sound giving no hint of the dazzling sprays of light that I can't see but can imagine so clearly. Happy fucking New Year, I say to nobody, then give the envelopes a final look before I lay back on the love seat and listen to the fireworks, wondering what I'm going to do. And that's the end of that little opening section. I chose to read that little section partially because it's the very beginning of the book, and it's meant to be a little, I don't know, a little amuse-bouche, perhaps, to the rest of the book, a little window into the central conflict at the center of this book, which is sort of Rainey trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life. She is this music prodigy who has been made an offer to join a record label, but she's also getting pressure to go to college, and she can't decide which is the right path for her. And it also was a little bit of a callback to the first book about Rainey, Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze, which also opens with a little flash forward and similarly sort of sets the table. So I think I'll pause there because I'm good at talking, and I'll just keep talking if I don't stop myself. And I'll kick it over to Jody for a little taste of her book.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Julia and Michael and Ben, for sharing the stage, and for everybody who came tonight. And right now we can only see about 6 people, but I know there are more, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be virtually with us tonight. I'm going to read just similarly to what Benjamin just did. I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of my novel, Without You Here. There are timestamps at the beginning of every chapter, so I'll share that here. I'm sure in our conversation we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. This one is circa 1960, 20 years before, and I have to pardon my cat who's just jumping out of my lap. All right. Circa 1960, 20 years before. Noni's playing tightrope on the floor while her mother pays bills at the table beyond the counter. The kitchen smells like the fried chicken her mother made for her bridge ladies the day before. If Noni squints her eyes right, the floor tiles line up and the seam between them becomes the rope. She feels herself aloft, senses a city street below, with its different smells of bus exhaust and restaurants, plus crowds milling, beginning to gather, craning to see the little girl so far above. They jostle, whistle, and cheer for her, hoping she won't fall. Noni, why don't you go play outside? Her mother's voice startles her and she almost falls. The crowd gasps, jumps apart, as if making room for her to crash. And then they're gone. Noni can't see them anymore. I'm being very quiet, she says. Her mother always wants her outside, but right now the tightrope beckons. She concentrates to get it back, to recall the people, the height, the distant sound of traffic. Noni has heard talk of people who run away to join the circus. She doesn't know how they know where to go. Do they have to wait until a circus comes to their town? Is there an office somewhere? She pictures a tall, round man, balding with a black fringe of hair at his ears, sitting behind a desk in a crisp, clean suit with a flash of red at the breast pocket. He's a circus man, so it could be a magic handkerchief, one that pulls and pulls and pulls and changes color, makes people laugh. But his face is serious. He isn't used to girls no taller than his waistline, presenting themselves for work. I'm very good at the tightrope, she tells him. A girl so small as you? His face crinkles in doubt. I can walk across any rope, she says, no matter how high. At mention of the word, the seam between the floor tiles transforms back into a tightrope, and she and the circus man now stand near the ledge of a tall building from which the rope extends, connecting to the ledge of another equally tall building across the street. People gather once more, shuffling and clamoring below. Their noise reaches Noni as a muffled hum. I'm not sure I should let you do this, the man says, rubbing his chin and shaking his head, keeping his distance from the edge. I can do it, sir, Noni says. I'm not afraid. Noni? Her mother's voice is sharp. I can't think with you muttering away in there. Noni ignores her. The circus man holds both her hands in his and levels her with an important look. You must be very careful. I'm always careful, she says. I'm very good at this. She drops the man's hands and makes a T with her arms, gently places one foot on the wire. It wobbles, wobbles. She places her other foot. The crowd whoops. The rope swoops, then steadies. She places one foot forward, then the next, repeats, Noni, enough. Her mother's words let loose a surge of unease. The crowd below has lost its faith. Now they wish for her to fall. Clouds shift outside, and sunlight knifes across the kitchen floor, carving a whole new line that slices the kitchen tile pattern in half. splitting her rope in half. She sees and can't look away. She can't fix her eyes on her destination anymore, and she knows a great height stretches below. Ahead of her, the floor, one half bright, one half dark, and her broken rope dangling. There is no choice but to fall. So I chose to read that also, like Benjamin said, because it's the beginning. But to me, this also sets up a basic understanding of one of the point of view characters, Noni. And that is that reality is sort of an intrusion for her. She has a different way of approaching the world. And if only the world would let her stay there, then things may be different for her. But and she's one of the voice characters, and the other is her niece Noreen, which we'll talk more about. But that's the beginning. Thank you. Off to you, Michael.
Thank you both for sharing that beginning section of your books and giving us the context for understanding the worlds that you've built. And really, I'm a humble poet. I don't build worlds in my work. I am always, always amazed by the way folks who write novels are able to construct these worlds and bring characters into them and then help the characters figure out what they're supposed to do. And, both of your books really have characters who are engaged in the process of figuring out what they're supposed to do. Very different situations, very different stimuli, but I really, as I was reading both of them, loved the vulnerability in these characters and the acknowledgement that they don't know what they're supposed to do and that it is really letting the story unfold. I found both of them incredibly readable for that reason. I did not want to put them down. I did not want to do all of the things that I had to do. So I was glad when I finished them and I could actually get around to, emptying the dishwasher and that sort of thing. Because these books felt more important than that to me. So thank you for that. So I want to just really start with asking, since Ben read first, Ben, what's it like to write a sequel? Blow my poet mind on the fact that you not only have built a world, you've expanded it.
I don't know. It was a weird process. I never really expected to do a sequel. It was not something I ever really, I mean, when I think of sequels, I think of like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. And like, I think of, these, I don't know, for some reason, the word sequel feels, that has this epic connotation to me, even though there are sequels in quieter ways, of course. But when I started to dream and imagine a sequel, I was a little bit daunted by a couple things. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to recapture the spark in the voice that I felt like I'd worked so hard to create in the first book, because it takes time to develop that voice, and to really get it to where you want it. And the second kind of bigger question was like, can I come up with a compelling enough set of story elements to actually justify a sequel? And once I'd made the decision and started to brainstorm and started to write some scenes, that was the biggest sort of barrier early on, was that I wasn't sure that I had a compelling enough reason to do a sequel. And I almost didn't do it because I couldn't come up with, I was like, this is not Star Wars. Like, the audience is not like knocking, banging down my door, like, we gotta have more Rainey Cobb, even though there were a few people who were like, hey, we'd love another book.
I was one of those, and I'm devastated to know that my incessant asking you whether there would be a sequel was almost not enough.
It helped. It definitely helped. But the thing is that, like, with the first book, the story was quite clear to me once I got to the point of writing it. I knew that it was a story that's asking the question, who am I? In the first book, Rainey, who has grown up in this very unusual musical world. Her parents are sort of famous musicians. She's grown up homeschooled and traveling the country and living a very unusual life. And when she starts to realize that, when she's 15, she longs to break free from the constraints that have been placed around her and become her own person, which is, sort of what's old is new again. But I was able to bring it alive to a way that I was really satisfied with, this question of who am I, but I couldn't come up with a compelling enough sort of like reason to write a second one. And then I realized that if I fast forwarded a little bit and pushed her a year out to where she was about to graduate from high school, I could sort of deal with her having to stare down what's next in my life. And so this book is really about, what do I want? And then I started to sort of think about, okay, what does she want, and what's going to get in the way of her getting what she wants? And you know, the central conflict in this book is she going to sign with a record label, or is she going to go to college? Her parents have been sort of chewed up and spit out by the music industry, and they, of course, want her to have a little bit of a safety net. And I think that's okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with, like, the parents are not the bad guys in the book for wanting that. I think they're actually really smart and practical, and they've learned the hard way. But she also is enormously talented, and is having, you know, kind of the moon and stars dangled in front of her face by this woman from a record label. And the other thing that I was really intrigued by that kind of kept me going in this book was the idea that you don't necessarily have to know what you want, and figuring out what you want is not necessarily an as the crow flies endeavor. I think, like, we imagine that, oh, there's epiphanies and we just know what we want someday, but I don't feel like that. I think most people don't feel like that, that where you end up in your life is more of a game of pinball than, like, you know, a straight line that you're sort of walking down incessantly. And I'd like the idea of Rainey thinking she knows what she wants, but then changing her mind, and then other influences would come in, and then she gets mad about the pressure she's getting, but then she can also appreciate it at the same time. She's also a teenager, so she needs support from the people around her, even as she's pushing them away. So in question, what's it like to write a sequel? For me, it was really about getting the story in my head and coming up with a compelling conflict for Rainey. Once I had that, then writing it was actually not the most difficult part of it. I actually found my way back into her voice more easily than I expected. And the new characters I created took a little bit of time, but actually it was kind of nice. It was like putting on, you know, a comfortable pair of jeans where they're nice and broken in, and you're like, oh man, I love these jeans. You know, I could wear these jeans all day, because I already knew her and her brother and her parents, and I had these settings that I'd worked hard to create that I could go back to. So in some ways, some of the hard work was kind of already done for me, because I had already populated a lot of the world with the decisions I had made in the first book. So it was hard, but then it was not as hard as the first one.
Well, as a reader, I could not see any of that work. It was seamless. Because when I knew that this book was coming out, I reread Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze. And so I just kind of rolled from one into the other. And so I think you did a phenomenal job with carrying forward the characters in the world.
The other thing I'll say about this is that I specifically wanted this book to be able to be a kind of a reward for anybody who had read the first one, and it would sort of like deepen your experience. But I also wanted it to be able to stand alone, because I didn't feel like I had the sort of like platform or popularity that would require people to go back and read the first book. And I didn't want to have to set it up that way when I was sort of promoting it and putting it out in the world. So I wrote it hoping that it could speak for itself and stand by itself. So that was a bit of a challenge as well. But I'm glad it felt like a continuous journey that you just kept going on.
Yeah, beautifully done. And speaking of journeys and speaking of continuous, Jody, your book does not read like one continuous sweep. It's constructed in such a fascinating and intricate way of moving backwards and forwards in time. What was it like to write that, and to, you know, how did you devise that structure? How did you decide which were the moments that you would include?
Such a great question, because that was the hardest part of writing this book by far. The first draft that I wrote, I did write in a linear fashion, and I don't know how many people, I see familiar faces who have read the book, but for those of you who haven't, it follows sort of the ripple effects of the tragic loss of Noreen's aunt, Noni, to suicide when Noreen is 8 years old. So when I did this in a linear fashion, and always it was important to me to include both of their voices. So when I did it in a linear fashion, there were too many years where Noni's voice wasn't present. And it didn't work for me, because to me, it really was a story that belonged to both of them. It's on the one hand a story of grief, but it's also a story of this really lovely connection that they have. So it was important for me to value both of those equally.
Mm.
So first, the linear thing was just a complete and utter flop. It was imbalanced, like a table missing a leg, and I also had a third point of view character in there that wasn't helping things at all. So so well, I
Get out of
thought
here.
so at first, but anyway, so then over the course of much effort, I rewrote it in so many different ways, trying to keep Noni's voice alive, trying to figure out a way. And then I read Jane Allison's craft book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, that investigates alternatives to the Freytag triangle, which is the typical plot structure we're kind of taught, I think, probably at first and eighth grade. But when I saw that all the different options that she was exploring and sort of explicating in her book, it gave me hope, because I knew from the beginning that that this book was asking me to do something that I didn't know how to do yet. So I was just kind of searching this whole time. So I read that book and I thought, oh, I'll put it out of order. And then it was like an eraser just scraped everything out of my head. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you just, okay, so it's not in order. What is it? So I was kind of floundering for a little while, and my youngest took, I put all these like index cards. I put like the guts of every chapter on index cards, because I was always shuffling them out and seeing if they needed to happen in a different order, not nonlinear at that point. And then, so I had tons of them from chapters that I had long since abandoned, including ones that had been there from the beginning, everything in between. And Jillian took them all and input them into a big spreadsheet. And Clara, my older, goes through the spreadsheet and studies it and churns very carefully, churns out a suggested sequence for the whole book. And I sit down with this and I start working and immediately start changing things. And then it evolved into a completely different thing. The first chapter wasn't there until near the very end, when I felt like we really needed to know a little bit about Noni when she was the same age Noreen is at the beginning of the book, and to get a hint of how problems that kind of follow her through life have been following her for a really long time. So all of those things together like set me up to figure out how to splice these chapters together. And then the rest was kind of using my gut to figure out which ones kind of leaned against each other and kept the pressure. The past was kind of set there to keep pressure on the present, so that you could see why this moment was significant without having to contextualize it by some flashback or some, sort of maudlin reminiscence. It could just hold its own.
Yeah, and two things. One, I think that you are really successful with that in this book. I am very very aware of sentimentality and that sort of thing that happens where sort of cheap artificial emotions are worked into something. And there was no sentimentality at all in this book. There was a lot of sentiment, there was a lot of emotional complexity and nuance, but it never felt like you were playing for the cheap seats. It wasn't just a tearjerker.
Well, and what you said reminded me I went to a writing conference and I got to work with Tim O'Brien once
Mm,
many years ago. And someone was asking him a question about how to avoid sentimentality. And he said, don't be afraid of sentiment, be afraid of fraudulence. And I
yeah.
thought that was really helpful. So that's something that stuck with me. To me, it says you go right for the jugular of the messiest part of that emotion, and you don't apologize for it. You don't try to explain it. You just go grab that.
Yeah, you let the reader have the reaction that you want them to have, whatever it is. And yeah, I mean, as I was reading the book before, when we were in the green room backstage, before we let everyone in, we were chatting a bit about this, and Jody mentioned that there is a plot line in this book that's central that involves suicide, and September is National Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month, and we were talking a bit about friends that we've lost to suicide. And I said, it's a hard thing to write about because it is so painful, but Jody does it with such nuance and with such complexity. It feels to me like affording the full experience. And that's something that, I think lesser writers might shy away from.
Thank you, Michael. It's very nice.
The other thing I wanted to ask is whether your kids are available to help me organize a poetry manuscript.
You're not the first to ask. You're not the first to ask.
Talk out.
I had a follow-up question for Jody really fast on this. I
Please.
was thinking about the structure of moving around in time. We spend time with Noreen as a girl when she knows Aunt Noni, and then we also spend quite a lot of time with her in her adult life when she is dealing with her own issues, but Noni is sort of always in the background in her memories. And I was curious about what it was like to write a character at such divergent times in her life. Like, did you worry about trying to capture an essence that carried through? Was it more like, oh, it's like in a film where we know it's not the same actor, it's just a kid, and then it's actually Tom Hanks later? Or, was it how much did you stress about trying to make it a direct through line, and how much was it like she's a kid here and she's an adult here and they're not really the same person?
I was definitely like banking on her being the same person, but it's interesting because I was thinking about this very question when you were talking about picking up Rainey Cobb's voice again, because you do pick it up at a different stage of her life than she was before. So there has to be change in that voice. And that was definitely a challenge for this book because I'm dealing with Noreen at such drastically different stages of her life. She's 8 years old, she's 16 years old and getting into trouble. She's in college and trying to find her way. She's a young married person kind of stuck in an unpleasant relationship. And to me, I don't know if I can even articulate it, but like I felt like I was obeying Noreen's past as I was writing her present, and really aware of the different pressures on her. She and Noni are so alike in so many ways, but I don't think you'd get confused about whose chapter we were in, even if you didn't have like the date that would clearly give it away, because Noni's connection to the world is so much different from Noreen's, and has, she really struggles with that connection in a way that Noreen doesn't, even though she has her struggles. So yeah, I tried to stay true. And again, that was a challenge because you had to do it over so many years, but yeah.
In terms of that, I have a follow-up question just because I'm trying to wrap my brain around it. When you were editing this, because I'm such a process nerd for how people bring books out of their brains into the world. In just the terms of editing it, when you were going through, how long did it take you to get everything lined up the way it needed to be to tell this story?
Again, that's a many splendored question. It went through so many different drafts before it got to this one. By the time it got to this one, by the time I was working with the altered timeline and I was sifting to put them in order, there was still a lot of work to be done to make sure all the seams lined up, so to speak. But that was easier than having done all the work before and having created the worlds and taken chapters away. There were several chapters that were with the book in its earlier stages that I was very attached to, that entire scenes and elements from their lives that got tossed. But that was one of the interesting things about then embodying Noreen across different stages of her life. I'd written a lot more of those stages of her life in other versions. So I actually knew her pretty well throughout those different things. So yeah, it was all over the place in terms of how long it took to get to that point. But once I was at the point of changing up the timeline, it was, still a lot of work, but not anything like what went before it.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. And, I'm thinking like maybe someday there will be a director's cut version where you'll have all of the supplementary materials that people can read to get to know how you got there. But just in terms of process, I think for those of us who see the finished book, to realize that it is, to use an overused metaphor, the tip of an iceberg of work, and that so much was below the waterline. Ben, did you have a similar experience with that, or did you feel like, because you had already built out the world that Rainey was in, you were just exploring more? I've now switched to a video game metaphor for those of you playing along at home.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit more the latter. My book follows a fairly traditional A to B, linear structure. And so each writing project is a little different and asks, I think, different challenges of you depending on how you decide to enter the world and how you decide to structure the story. These books are pretty straightforward. They're first person, present tense. And so there are a lot of advantages to writing first person present tense, but there are a lot of enormous disadvantages too. And one of them is, I think, the limited, things that you can really do with structure if you're going to try to respect. And in fact, it's, someone said to me, like, how can there be a flash forward at the beginning of the book if it's first person present? And I was like, you're not supposed to ask that question. So for me, it was more the hard work in the pre-writing and in trying to work out and puzzle through the sort of like emotional arc of the story, and getting that sort of in focus. And then you make a mess of it when you're writing it, because no matter how cleanly or clearly you think you have something in your mind, the making of it automatically changes the thing itself. Like a book is in some ways like a house, but in other ways it's not like a house. Like you can't draw a blueprint and, okay, this line is going to be 8 inches long and that wall is going to be 20 by 19. Like a book is not like that. Like the making of the thing changes the thing through the making of it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so even if you think you really have it clearly in your head, you have to be ready for that truth to hit you over the head. By the time you get to the end, it will have landed in a different spot than you intended. And that's, why we have revision. So
That's the fun
yeah.
of it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's really like that. The discovery is what makes it such a joy.
Absolutely. People ask the question, like, are you a plotter or a pantser? As if, you're there's only two sides, you're either a plotter or a pantser. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to give myself just a clear enough sense enough that I know which direction I'm driving, but I don't want to know exactly what the destination looks like. Because like Jody said, the magic is in losing yourself in that draft. And I don't know, it sounds like a little like mystical or something, but I really do think if you're open to it, the characters kind of take over. It's kind of bizarre. There's a great craft book by Haruki Murakami, who's a favorite novelist of mine, but he writes killer nonfiction too. And he has this great book, I think it's called Novelist as Vocation, which is like the worst title of a book ever, but it's a really cool book. And he talks about his writing process, which is so free form. And he doesn't literally plans nothing. He has no idea what's going to happen. I mean, he's like the ultimate pantser, and I couldn't be quite that pantsalicious. But yeah, for me, that's part of the fun of it. And then in revision, I think you bring it into focus. But this book has sort of a linear A to B structure, so that was not as big of a challenge as I think it could have been and was for Jody, certainly.
Amazing insights. And you made me think that writing a novel is also a little bit like dealing with quantum theory, because when you're observing something, you're changing the nature of it. And I think that's a really powerful thing for any of us who write to think about. I want to digress a little bit into something a little more lighthearted. Both of these books involve music. And both of you have talked extensively in different places about the way your writing process and your characters interact with music. Jody, you did a great conversation with the Large Hearted Boy blog about music. And Ben, you and I have talked about music quite a bit, but
yeah,
Rainey is a musician. Rainey is a musician in the 90s, which was sort of my native time period, I guess. So, the ways that both of you brought music into your books as flavor was really interesting to me. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And
I'm
just
gonna let Benjamin go first because that is such a large element in your book.
Yeah, sure. I'm, anybody who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with music. If I'm awake, there's music on in my house, and I just sort of want to bathe in music all the time, whether I'm hearing it or thinking about it or talking about it, or I don't even know, whatever. So in a lot of ways, my writing is just an excuse to like think about music more deeply. And so it's no accident that I created these characters that are musicians, because in some ways it was an excuse just to get to live in the world of music. But I think there's something really particular about the music that you discover when you're a teenager.
Mm,
And that's part of what these books are about. They're about the creative evolution of a young artist, Rainey Cobb kind of figuring out who she is creatively, what she cares about, what she likes. And I think there's something very particular about the music you fall in love with when you're 14, 15, 16, 17 that like sears itself into your soul way down in there in a way that no other music you'll ever love does quite the same way. And I'll bet it's true for everybody listening, even if you don't listen to that music anymore, because I don't listen to much of the stuff now that I did when I was 16. But when I hear those songs, the songs that were played at the eighth grade dance or the senior prom, or the stuff that you remember having the CD in your car, like they are so real to me in a way like no other music ever has been. And so in the first book, Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze, I had a lot of fun revisiting sort of like the classic grunge of the era, largely like through Nirvana and some of the great female singer-songwriters, but more kind of stuff that was really popular. And Rainey kind of gets her mind blown by Nirvana and those kind of bands. In this book, she meets this girl, Mia, who's a love interest in this book. And Mia is like one of those ultimate music snobs. She's like your friend who only listens to the bands that nobody's ever heard of, and like if it's too popular then it sucks, you know and for better or worse, I think I love that kind of music listener, and I'm like that a little bit myself, probably. And so this book is more kind of underground, stuff that's a little more off the beaten path, indie rock. And the transformative musician in this story is Elliott Smith. So I spent a lot of time listening back to the music of Elliott Smith. If you remember in that prologue that I read, she puts on Elliott Smith's classic album, Either Or. Ironically enough, Elliott Smith died by suicide. So there's this crazy connection back to this larger conversation. To this day, I can barely listen to Elliott Smith because the music is so raw to me. But also as a performer, I've played a lot of music, I've recorded music, and I like the opportunity to bring people into these worlds. There's something I like reading about people who know how to do stuff well,
mm,
in whatever it is, whether it's tennis or archery, I don't even care. Like if someone is describing somebody doing something on an expert level, I'm here for it. And so I like being able to share my knowledge in that way through the characters. Rainey's brother is like a real gearhead, so he's the guy who knows just what angle to like put the microphone at. Like you're never going to do it at the right angle when you're recording, but he knows, no man, it's got to be like this, or it's going to kick back or whatever. Those little details I think are really, I think you can fake that stuff or you can watch videos or do research, but I think there's something in having done it yourself and having swim in those waters that I was really excited to bring to life in these books and in these characters.
mm, yeah.
What about you,
Jody,
Jody?
So yeah, because my book crosses so many different eras. Like the earliest part we saw in the opening was from 1960, and that's it's kind of a solo one. Then there's a lot in 1979 and 1980. Then there's stuff through the 90s up until 1999 and the end of 1999. So it's a swath of not the music I'm listening to now so much, but I did kind of dig in and listen to a bunch of different things so that I could, especially the 1979, 1980, because I was really trying to jog my memory for other things, that other flavors of how things felt, how things looked, other, maybe objects that I might have forgotten about, just to kind of reorient my whole brain to the time period. And that was interesting and fun. And I had like a playlist that I would listened to while I was writing those parts of the book. And then, some of it was just informed by stuff that I was really into in college. And I'm not the risk taker that my characters were. I never hitchhiked to see the violent femmes. However, I would have seen them if my friends would have taken me with them. It's like I've never forgiven them for going without me. But anyway, um, so there were things like that kind of drew from stuff that I knew, feelings that I knew, um, associations that made sense to me. There's also like, there's a showing of Grandma's Feather Bed by John Denver, which is a like sort of beautifully horrible song. Um, that was very much a part of the soundtrack of my childhood. Like it was before the pop and country charts were so completely defined and separated on our radio stations. So you heard a lot of both. So it was, everywhere. So which is actually another element of kind of getting the time right. That that it's all of these different influences. But there was something so innocent about that song, and using that for the juncture that it plays in Noreen's life was, to me, its ridiculousness kind of increased the poignance of the scene in a way, or the poignancy of the scene.
Yeah. Yeah, and I popped the link to the Large-Hearted Boy piece where Jody's playlist is linked, and where she says one of what might be my favorite assessments of any character's musical personality ever, where she says that Noni was more T-Rex than Elton John, which I think, if you get into the 70s and know who those artists are, and I hope you'll take the time if you don't, it really says a lot about who Noni is, and it's pitch perfect. So yeah, I mean, you both use music as color and texture so beautifully in these books. So thank you for indulging me as a music snob in that little sidetrack of the conversation. So yeah, it's inescapable in both of these books that life and the trajectory of life leads to grief. And I want to know a little bit about how you chose to write about these topics. What was it that you wanted to bring to the world through these characters' experience with grief?
Jody, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think there were a number of things. I mean, first of all, I always think about the way the ideas come, and that the characters come to me sort of with the problems that they have, and I have to figure out how to tell them. So I didn't like set out to write a story that was about grief or about suicide. I found these characters, and that's what they were dealing with. So that's one of those weird mystical things about the writing process, like where it begins. And these characters kind of came with those issues like already there. And as I got to know them better, I kind of dug deeper and deeper into try to understand how they worked. And I think there were a few things that are important for what I hope are takeaways for readers. And one is that like it takes as long as it takes. Grief is a complicated thing, and sometimes parts of it stay with you, and that's there are gifts that come along with that the opposite of a gift. And there's also a sense in this book that's it's not a spoiler to know that the aunt dies from suicide. We learn within the first 10 pages. So it's kind of a thing that's with us the whole time. But what's also with us the whole time is this really strong bond that she and Noreen share. They're both kind of different from the people around them, not just in their family, but kind of in the world. Noni a little more so than Noreen, but they're not people that feel completely seen and recognized by the rest of the world very often. So that bond lasted really strongly for Noreen. And to me, that's one of the important parts of this story, that here was Noni, who was troubled and lost and in so many ways broken, but she left this love for Noreen that stayed with her for her whole life. And it's that truth that our love can be that precious regardless of how complicated we might be. That is a takeaway that I hope readers go away with.
Yeah, that's really well said. You handle that stuff with such sensitivity and so nicely. For me, it's maybe a little bit different. My book does deal with grief a little bit, but I think it's actually more about the sort of intense reality of living around and with someone who is very ill. In the story, we learn pretty early on that Rainey's father is battling advanced lung cancer, and it becomes, this source of enormous pain in her life, obviously, because she's very close with her father. They have a really special bond. They sort of have this, just a deep connection. She's probably closest to him of anybody in her life. And so it's very painful for her to watch him suffer. But having spent time around people who were ill and people who were dealing with cancer, there's the emotional intensity of that experience, but there's also like this incredible like physical reality that comes with living through illness and being around someone who is battling an illness that I think is sometimes underrepresented in when we write about cancer and write about illness, that there is a really physical part of this experience. And that's part of what Rainey's dealing with. She has to take on some of the burden of taking her father up to the hospital for his treatments, helping him when he is ill and tending to him a little bit. And I think that's obviously a really painful experience for anybody to go through, but you also learn through that experience sort of the totality of life, and that you can endure such things, and it depends on, everybody's life is different depending on what you might be exposed to. Some people are forced to deal with that as a child and very young. Some people go half their lives and never have to bump into that, but we're all going to bump into it sooner or later. And we are all sort of the sum total of our experiences, the good and the bad, and we all lose people, and we all have to know people who get sick, and it's horrible, it's awful, but we also learn to go on living anyway, and that is its own sort of powerful affirmation. It's in some ways that it's like this weird celebration of life almost, to realize that you can endure pain like that and still find joy in life, and still, the sun comes up tomorrow and you just have to keep getting up and going through your days. And that's a powerful lesson too. And there's a strange kind of beauty in it at the same time. So I sort of found myself exploring that as I was writing this. Grief, yes, but in some ways I was more interested in that sort of physical reality and how someone is changed by being exposed to someone who's very ill.
I want to jump in and just say something. I feel like you handled that really well. And I also want to mention, I don't know if we've said it already, but that yours is a young adult novel.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate how you've handled like two very different but very specific things. And one would be the illness, like dealing with a parent who's ill or a family member who's ill. But the other is indecision. I really feel like we're in such an overachieving culture, to have a main character that's the hero of the book really struggle with indecision in a very vulnerable and gritty way. I think that's such an important thing for young readers to encounter, to be able to look up to someone who's struggling with things they're struggling with too, rather than have yet another person turn to them or source turn to them and say, you need to have it all decided already. So I appreciated those things about that book very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. That definitely comes from my years of being a teacher and being around a lot. I was a high school English teacher for 12 years. And, I think it's one of the greatest lies ever told, that you're just going to know what you want to do. You're just going to keep going, and then you're going to go to college, and you're just going to know. Don't worry, it'll come to you. You'll choose a major, and then you'll have a job, and it'll all just make sense to you someday. And then you get to middle age or whatever, and you're like, man, that was the biggest freaking lie that anybody ever told me. What a load of crap. Like it's a mess, and I also felt like for a young artist as gifted as Rainey, it would seem quite obvious that all she would ever want to do is play music and screw the man, and I would never consider having a sort of quote unquote average life. But I'm like, what if it wasn't that simple? What if it wasn't so Hollywood? Like it would be complicated. Like, and what if some of the pressure you get from people isn't necessarily bad? What if people have your best interest at heart and they really do know better because they've lived through things, and even where Rainey ends up at the end, and I do think she follows her heart in the end, whatever that means. I still wanted it to feel like, you know what, the other way probably could have been okay too.
Yeah.
It wasn't like good versus bad,
Hardest
because I don't,
decisions. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think life really works like that.
Yeah. No, and I will say, having not being a musical prodigy, not having had a lot of the choices that Rainey faced, but and I messaged Ben about this after I finished the book. It felt really true to me because I'm somebody who grew up with a parent who was ill and who died for me shortly after I graduated from high school. And there were a lot of things in the book where I was just like, yeah, this is right on. This is exactly what I remember feeling like. So, yeah, both of you just created these three-dimensional characters, and not just the main characters, but the ancillary characters, the secondary characters were also incredibly vivid and real. And I'm wondering a little bit about that. I'd love to hear you talk about how you create and depict characters that seem like I could bump into them in the supermarket.
Do you want to
So do you
start,
want
Ben?
to go? No, you go ahead, please.
All right. That there's a bunch of different things that can be said, but to me, I'm engaging with them as if they're real. Which one of the things that I try to do with each of my scenes, and anybody who's ever heard me talk about writing has probably heard me use this expression, but I'm try to see the scene. I try to look through the eye holes of every character, even when they're not the main character. And I put it that way on purpose because it's not just that I want to see what they're seeing. I want to see it from the inside of that person. There's such, like, if you think about having like two characters at a table and the bad guy's coming in behind one of them, only one of them can see the bad guy. So let's say your main character is the one who can't see the bad guy, but they can see the person seeing the bad guy. It's a whole different scene, right? But you can imagine what the reaction of this person would be, that this person would then pick up on, and how long it would take for them to turn around. But that's just like really trying to get into the physicality of the scene so that I'm not missing something that would be how this character would, like they can't just be a prop. If something's happening in the scene, I need to know how every character feels about it so that I'm not just thinking about telling the story that my character is experiencing. Because if it's a really good character, everything depends on the whole dynamic and not just that person. Because you can leave so much important stuff out if you don't remember the interaction, not just of the scene, but of humanity. Like, we are in interaction with people. And if we forget that, that's doom for the scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think mine partially grows out of it's a real pet peeve of mine when secondary characters feel like they're not well crafted, and like the author was just way more focused on the protagonist, and well, I got to put some other people here. There's got to be a sister, right? And there's got to be a best friend, and I guess I'll throw them in there too. And I just reject that. To me, you owe it to each of the characters to give them a unique identity, and to me, it all starts with what that person wants. I sort of start there. I think it's tempting to start with like, oh, I'm going to start with them having this cool jean jacket, and everything is about the jean jacket, man, and then it's all going to go from there. And to me, that stuff all has to come later. I need to understand their true motivation and intention. I feel like once I understand that, then I can start to build them a sort of three-dimensional character arc within the larger story, so that they sort of have their own unique footprint in the story, because I really work hard on that as a writer. It's something I take a lot of time to work on. So I'm always psyched when people say something like that, because that, to me, that's my little like, yeah, I got you. Yeah, I love taking the time to try to give these secondary characters their due, especially like people like parents. You know, I'll read like a young adult novel, and I find that oftentimes parents or teachers, or the characters that like embody the periphery of a young person's life, I think sometimes in young adult fiction often don't get treated with a ton of care and empathy. They just are there to either be a force of antagonism, or they're there to represent real life or whatever. And I'm like, screw that. Like, I want these parents to be, to feel real in and of themselves. They have their own motivation, they have their own needs. It's a complex, microcosm, each family and community of people.
Yeah. And you both render it so well. I mean, Ben, the venue manager in The Rest of Your Life soundtrack feels like a fully fleshed out character who's got a
I love that guy.
Yeah, he's got a story of his own that you could tell, although it's not germane to the book. I mean, these are the little things that I love, and you both do it so well. I'm wondering, this is a little bit of a departure from that line of questioning, but how much research do you do in terms of pulling together what it is that you want for the world that you're building? How much research do you do? You both have traveled back in time for these books. You don't have a DeLorean or a phone booth or any other actual means of time travel. So how do you get it right? Because you both got it right.
You want to go back?
Sure. Yeah, I did not do a ton of research for this book. I do like doing research, and I love, immersing myself in the landscape, in the world. One of the things I did the most research on was about the topic of like insurance. There's a conflict in this book around whether the family will be able to pay for these cancer treatments. And I created this conflict that the treatment might be stopped if they couldn't pay for it at a certain point. And I was like, is that even real? So I actually don't know if the situation I created is 100% accurate, but I did make some calls and do some research on those kinds of like sort of specific micro topics to try to make it a little bit more accurate. There's the thing about college scholarships. I reached out to some guidance counselors to ask some questions about that. There's I don't know if I want to spoil it, but there is a very famous legendary musician who actually makes a guest appearance in this book, which is I've never done that before. I put a real person into this fictional world, a real person that's very dear to me. And I was very nervous about doing that because the people who know, and they would care that it was done well, or with the intention of doing it well. And so I spent a lot of time actually reacquainting myself with interviews of people who had known that person, what they looked like, what they sounded like. I listened to recordings of that person's voice and watched interviews of them speaking at length to try to imagine what their cadence might be in a conversation. That I probably did the most research on that angle. There's a very short scene toward the end of the book, but I probably researched that more thoroughly than any other part of the book. And then some other things about the music industry in the 90s, but I was in high school, and so a lot of it was just right there for the taking. There wasn't anything that niche. Yeah. What about you,
I
Jody?
love how you said you didn't do much research, and then
Yeah, except for those 9 areas.
exactly,
Mhm.
they were super in depth. I think it's because like the research we do for fiction doesn't feel like the research you do for like a
Yeah,
dissertation. So
maybe that's what
I
it
mean,
is.
yeah, because I did many like just deep dives on. There were so many aspects I wanted to get right. One thing that comes to mind is there's a scene where Noreen falls off of a tire swing and breaks her arm, and the arm bone shows. in previous versions, there were more chapters really right after that, and a lot more that I needed to get right about what happened. But I talked to a general practitioner. I talked to the mother of a child who had had that kind of fall, and the child, because they were family friends. So I interviewed them both, and I took like copious notes, but finding out like what exactly happens, what are the dangers, what are the, what's the protocol, how would someone react seeing this, like am I getting the reactions right to this very scary moment. So and then Noni has panic disorder, and that is a distinction in under anxiety disorders that didn't exist in the psychiatric DSM until 1980, which is the year that she dies. And so it was important to me to place that in a time period where we were still getting to know that ailment. So that was an interesting thing that I spent a lot of time researching. I have some familiarity with anxiety. I have some familiarity with depression. I have, family and friend connections with a variety of different that have had exposures personally. But I wanted to make sure that I knew more than that, because I didn't want to treat any of these situations as, like convenient for me, convenient for the plot. I wanted them to be fully fleshed out. So I interviewed a psychiatrist at UVA that specializes in anxiety disorders, as well as at least one person that was an acquaintance that suffered from a significant anxiety disorder. And just to say, YouTube has some amazing documentary footage. The Australian government has wonderful documentaries about many mental health issues, and a really trove of stuff about panic disorder. And also there were these archival footage of actual therapy sessions from like the 1960s, where everyone's like smoking like a chimney. And but it was interesting to me because then I'm seeing how this is talked about at that time, which would have been a little before my character came into it, but it still felt germane to the whole thing, kind of understanding the trajectory of how this is treated in the world. It became clear to me as I was developing this story that there was a lot here that I wanted to really do proper service to. So the amount of research I did, definitely, I read lots of books. I mean, like I spent hours and hours on these topics, just trying to make sure that I was creating someone realistic.
Well, I would say those hours and hours paid off, and really, leads a little bit into my next question, which is, did either of you have folks who served as beta readers or sensitivity readers, especially given the nature of grief and the things that cause grief for the characters in your books?
I'd say like a number of different types of readers. So I had just, friends that read early versions, but I also had, there's a question and answer at the end of my book that's put together for book clubs, but it can also be used in a therapeutic setting. A writer friend of mine who's also a licensed social worker and has been teaching social work as therapy for 20 some years, helped me craft that so that it would be a good vehicle for starting difficult conversations around some of these issues. So and I talked to people at the local suicide prevention nonprofit in town to try to talk to them about how do I talk about this in public, like to make sure that I'm being respectful and careful about how I just describe what the book is about and how I talk about it in settings like this and otherwise. So lots of different stages along the way. Some, so like I didn't hire a specific sensitivity reader. It seems to me that that's come into fashion, not fashion. I mean, it's become more common in the last couple of years. And this book was done sort of by the time you could officially, that I knew about hiring an official sensitivity reader, but I did that in a number of other ways before that.
Yeah, I also relied on, I mean, I think of it more of like a, am I full of crap readers? You know, there to sort of help me out a little bit. When I set out to write, you know, a book about a queer teenage girl, I knew I was going to need some help because I'm not a queer teenage girl. Um, I believed I could write this character well. I believed I could bring her to three-dimensional life because I think ultimately, you know, human emotion has a universality to it, and I think if you open yourself up to it empathetically, and you can find your way into the emotions, which are actually really the heart of the story. I think that's most of it. But I think we all have blind spots for sure, you know, and I was even a little bit paranoid about it when I was doing the first book. I remember writing the draft and getting kind of serious about starting to try to get it published and having a little bit of a freak out, like, oh my God, like what have I done? Like I can't believe I wrote this character. Like, are people going to get mad at me? Like, is this okay? You know, like, did I do a good job? Are people going to read this and be like, oh, this was obviously written by a straight man. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, stay away from this. And a lot of those fears, I think, were just in my head and just, you know, just natural, you know, imposter syndrome. I think that rears its head in all parts of life. But I wanted to take the extra step to put these books in front of queer readers, in front of women readers, and just sort of do a little bit of a gut check more than anything. With all that said, I do think as a writer, like you have to be able to trust your gut. Like I think that it's important to get feedback. It's super important to get, I think, your work in front of readers who know the terrain well and who could give you suggestions or be like, hey, you know, this didn't feel quite right. And I'm so grateful to the readers that helped me out along the way. But what I learned almost more than anything in the process was the need to sort of really, really build a barometer of trust in yourself, because ultimately it's your work and you have to stand by it and you have to believe that you can carry it off. You're going to need help, but that can only be a small slice of it. I think you have to be able to get most of the way there yourself. And that's a different kind of, I think, emotional journey to being open, to taking your time, to doing a ton of careful revision, to being tough on yourself, to being honest with yourself, doing research and thinking it through. But yeah, I'm very grateful to the handful of readers that helped me out.
Piggyback on that for a second, because I think that's something that that gets talked about a lot in literary circles, is whose story is this to tell? And I think it's a genuinely good question to answer and to ask ourselves. But and it's interesting how much like flack there is out there about it. But one of the things that I've consistently read in essays by people from communities that other communities are trying to represent and doing their best to represent them, but you know, having this controversy come up about is, and I think it was maybe Alexander Chi who really came up with this really good, like, several bullet points of, if in your bookshelf there is no one there, not the person you're representing in your book, of whatever, like, marginalized community you're representing in your book, if you don't have any writers from that marginalized community on your shelf, you might want to think twice. If you don't have any friends, family member in that marginalized community, you might want to think twice. So basically saying, like, if you don't know these people in the real world and you haven't made a significant effort to know these people in your literary world, it's probably not your turn to tell their story. And I think that's a pretty succinct way of thinking about it. And I think it's also possible sometimes, and I just want to say, I think Ben did a marvelous job. Like, I think you hit the notes, and I'm somebody that's very skeptical about men telling women's stories. And so like, I was a harsh reader, could have been a harsh reader, really enjoyed it. I think you did it. I think it's a good gut check for ourselves. Like, if we're doing this as, like, we have to question why we're wanting to tell that story. We have to go through these motions and make sure that we're not just doing lip service to it. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree with that. I agree from my, straight male perspective that Ben hit all the right notes. But, as I was reading it, as I was reading both of your books, I found characters in there that reminded me of people in my life. And, I think that's as high a praise as I can give your characters. Like, I really do feel like I have interacted with them and known them and hung out with them. So, yeah, I think you both did a marvelous job with that. I am mindful of time, and I want to make sure that we give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions before we wrap up. No pressure. You don't have to unmute and speak if you don't want to. You can certainly pop questions in the chat, and I will be happy to read them for Jody and for Ben. And if you need another couple of minutes to think of questions, I can certainly keep asking them some of the questions that I have lined up. So, all right, not hearing any immediate takers, I am going to give folks a chance to think about that. And I'm going to ask you both, what is your favorite part of the writing process? And please do not say when it's over.
Favorite part of the writing process, I would say for me, it is the first draft. It is the sort of, I really am a big believer in sort of momentum and the mystical power of the first draft, and getting swept away by a story you just feel really compelled to get out of you. It's kind of a special feeling when it hits you, and it's the feeling that for me, it's like I can't stop. It's like I've got to get the notebook out. I've got to get to the computer before work. I've got to get that paragraph down before bed. Like, I love that part of the process when I'm just discovering the story and I feel just really excited about it, and I'm not in my critical brain yet, and I'm just sort of having fun writing. I mean, for whatever reason, I find it great fun to sit in a chair for a long time and put words on a screen. I'm a little bit, I'm weird that way. I understand that, but that's a great time for me when it's going well.
Me
It's a
too.
good
Yeah.
weird.
I'd agree. The rapturous part of it is my favorite part. Just getting lost in it, the way I get lost in a good book. I have to say though, after having the story collection come out and talking to groups of people who've read them, and like it is so. The other part of the writing process is the aftermath. Is when somebody has really connected with something that you wrote, and it hits them in a special way, and it feels like this sort of, I don't know, this little mystical promise has been, fulfilled or something. And that's been a really satisfying part of having the book out there.
I want to make sure we get to Julia's question, which she put in the chat. What's something you learned from these publications that you will carry into the next one?
Do you want to go ahead, Jody?
Sure. I was thinking as you were thinking,
Yeah.
but one of the things that came to my mind is, I have two books out now from small presses, and for years I was, different projects, finishing and tabling them and coming back and finishing new ones. I had been like doing the agent route, knocking on agent doors. These two books, I was shopping them around right after COVID, when there was this huge like falling off in the agent world. Like there was like a log jam of all the books that they didn't want to release during COVID. So there weren't a lot of openings for agents or publications for a while there. But also a lot of agents discovered they could live more affordably if they weren't agents. So they left the field altogether. And that's when I started looking at the world of small presses, which is many splendored. So highly recommend checking out what's possible without an agent. And weirdly, I actually now have an agent. So the next time I come to this publication stage, I do actually get to, instead of approaching the black hole again, I get to approach a person, which is going to be, I'm really excited about. But yeah, so.
Congratulations on
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
really excited. Yeah, I'm really excited for Jody.
Thank
I think for me, it would be around the power of community. I'd been writing for a long time before having any books come out in the world, and I think the best part of being published and having the work out there is the connections you start to make with other writers, with the writing community, with readers. To me, I love to write. I like to be alone, and I love that side of myself. But I also have come to really love the power of community and connection. And it didn't always come naturally to me when before I was publishing. I was more, I think, like a solitary writing hermit guy, just kind of writing for fun by myself. And that's fine, that's totally fine. That's beautiful. But I've come to realize that I do need community, and I do need friends who do this work too, and I do need that support, and I want to share their successes as they share mine. So I'm psyched to have made a lot of new friends over the last couple of years, and so gain some a wider community than I ever knew was possible, sort of, in the literary world. So that's been great. I just want to keep growing that as much as I can, and staying connected to the people that I've met.
Amen to that. Yeah, the community is amazing. There are people I've met and become like immediate best buddies with that I just read with once, and
Yeah.
just there, I don't know, it's a whole different kind of community building that happens at this point. And I also just want to throw out there that I've done a lot of book reviews and author interviews over the years, and I cultivated that part of my literary community, and that was not why I did it, but that was there to catch me when my books came out. So I highly recommend, if you're looking to start publishing your own work, to really think about how you can lift up other writers and support other writers along the way, and build yourself into community that way. And it's productive, and it gives you a way to contribute to this weird and wonderful world of literature before your book might be ready.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, that is a really great way to sort of put a button on the end of the Q&A part. Although I am duty bound to ask, Jody, what are you working on next? Ben, will there be another Rainy book?
To be determined. I don't know yet. There's part of me that feels like 3 is just a great number, and so I think I might come back to the character, but I have the same dilemma as I did the second time, which is I don't have a story in mind yet. So it's nothing that I'm doing anytime soon until I have what I think is a compelling idea. I left her at a place that I think we could revisit her. I tried not to put too tidy a bow on it at the end of this one, because I wanted to leave it open for a revisiting of the character. We'll have to wait and see. I hope so.
I hope so too. No pressure. We'll talk about that later.
I'm working on another novel that's a sort of a family drama novel, and it's called Watchdog, and it's kind of linear. So I'm really excited about that. That we have a linear plot. Yes. So
linear so far.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
It's very nearly done. I'm in the final read throughs, which you have those final read throughs that then turn out not to be the final ones. I already had those, so these are the final read.
All right. Well, I am so thrilled that I was able to have this conversation with both of you tonight, to hear you both read a little bit of your books. I just dropped some links in the chat, so make sure that you go grab the links so that you can follow Ben and Jody on their websites and buy these most recent books. The links I put in there are bookshop books, so you'll also be able to buy previous books by Ben and Jody, and I highly recommend it if you haven't. Not only will you be supporting really wonderful authors, but you will have really wonderful books to read. I guarantee that. If you don't like them, let me know and I will apologize. There's not much more I can do than that, but I'll be really surprised if any of you say that you don't like them. So I want to bring Julia back in to help me thank both Jody and Ben, and to once again say, it's such an honor to be able to chat with you about literature. I'm already looking forward to the next time, assuming you want me back as host, but one way or the other, host or audience, I'll be there and I can't wait.
Yes, thank you so much, Ben and Jody, for choosing us to help promote your books. We're so excited that they're out in the world. Thank you, Michael, for hosting this event. You did a wonderful job, as always. And thank you everyone for attending. It really means a lot to see that we had a pretty full house tonight, and I recognize a couple of the alums in the audience, and it really does mean a lot to see you here supporting your fellow alums. And we hope at Cambridge Common Writers, when you need something promoted or us to help support you, that you'll reach out. For those who haven't visited the website, I'm just going to drop a quick link in the chat. So if you like, you can keep track of our news from our alum community, upcoming events. We have a meeting of our book club, Cambridge Common Readers, coming up next week with fiction alum Hurley Winkler. And you can check the website out for our bookstore page as well, which will give you links to all the works from our alums over the various years and genres. So thank you everyone again for attending. Thank you very much for tonight. It was wonderful to be here with everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Everybody.
Thanks for being
Thanks for
here.
coming. Great to
And
see
thanks
you.
for having us, Michael and
Yeah,
Julie.
of course. I really appreciate you guys.
You guys are the best. I love your books. I'm really excited for whatever you bring out next, even if it doesn't have Rainy Cop. It's fine.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.